In today's video, we're going to take a look at another feature that is going to be added to JavaScript in the very near future, and that is optional chaining. Now let's take a look at an example first, and we're going to get to what it is and how it's very useful. So suppose we have this sort of object, right? So this person object has a home object that has an address object, and this address has the street name and the number. So this is the sort of object you might encounter when you get the response from a server, for example, right? So a lot of objects, one inside another. Let's say we want to print the street, right? We want to do something with the street, so let's say we just want to print it on the console. So what do you usually do? Well, simple, just kind of say console, let's say this. I'm going to use a formatting thingy here. I'm going to say person.home.address.street, right? That's simple enough. I'm going to say here street so that we know what it is. And if I try to run this, you'll notice I'm going to get Downing Street. So that works. Nice. What's the issue with that, you say? Well, what if I told you that this object could have a lot of null objects, right? The home could be null. The address could be null. The person itself could be actually null. How are you going to deal with this? Well, first things first, if the street is null, we have that null coalescing operator that we talked about in a previous video. You can check up top. Nice. Now, taking a look at the other objects, if they are null, for example, if address is null, what do? Usually just provide a check here. Let's say if person.home.address is null, notice the loose equal here. So if I say loose equal null, that means that I am both checking for null and undefined, which is nice, I think, so that I don't have to worry about that. And if it's null, let's say console log no address provided, let's say, why not? And also let's move this in an else. So I'm going to say here else and move this guy here. And usually for readability's sake, I would just return in here, but you can't because we're not in a function right now. So it sort of gives us an error. But if you usually are in a function, if you are, do return out of here and not have this in an else statement due to readability's sake. It's just much easier to read that for now. But let's get back to it. So if this guy is null, then we're just going to print out no address provided. We can also check for if the street is null, right, in here. That's also fine. We can also do that, for example, and or this guy is null, do that as well. So if I try to, for example, comment out this guy and try to run this, you'll notice I'm going to get no address provided. That's normal. That's what we've seen before. That can be fixed with null coalescing operator. But if the address itself is null or undefined in this example, well, we are still going to get no address provided. That's fine. But what if the home object itself is also undefined? Well, in this situation, you're going to get an error that probably says something like this. Cannot read property address of undefined. Basically, it entered inside this if and said person.home, which is undefined, .address, and undefined.address gives us an error. So how do you fix this? Well, you add another check. Of course, you go, well, okay, person.home is null or undefined, yeah. So something like this. And then if you run this, now you're going to get a proper result, right? No address provided. So here's where the optional chaining operator comes in. This guy is going to simplify our checks here. So let's say we want these two to be just one single check. With the optional chaining operator, what you could do is, remember we had the error where person.home was null or undefined, and we wanted to access its address property. How can we prevent that if person.home is undefined or null? Well, if we prefix this dot with a question mark, what it says is, give me undefined if person.home is null or undefined. If it's not, then try to get the value of the address. Okay, so I hope this is kind of clear. So if I try to run this, remember home is still undefined, but using this operator now, it's not going to automatically access address of undefined. It's going to check, okay, wait, am I looking at something that's not even defined? Well, then just return undefined. There's no issue there. So if I try to run this, you will notice that we still get no address provided here, which is very nice. So, and we didn't have to check if person.home is null or undefined. And same thing we can do with the next check, right? We can check to see if the address itself is null or undefined. So if I uncomment this part, right, this is the situation where we had to check if address is undefined and then check its street, if it's null or empty or something like that. So what we can do is simply remove this prior check, add the optional chaining operator back to this part. So to check if person.home returned null or undefined, and then also check if person.home.address returned null or undefined. So what's happening here? If person.home is null or undefined, this expression is going to return undefined. And because of this expression being undefined, due to the second optional chaining operator, this whole expression is going to return undefined, which is loosely equal to null, right? And it's going to trigger our if statement, and it's going to be true, and it's going to execute this part. So if you try to run this here, as you can see, we get no address provided. And the really cool part is that not only does it check for null and undefined, if home is defined, if address is defined, like in this example, so if the person itself is well defined, it has everything it needs to get a street, this whole expression gets evaluated to the string itself, to this street name. So we can actually store this. So you can say let street equals this whole thing, right? And then we can check, is street null or undefined? Well, then no address provided. Simple as that. Otherwise, do print the actual street in here, so we don't have to repeat ourselves at all. Remember, when we had all those checks, we were repeating ourselves many times. We had person.home, person.home.address, person.home.address.street, twice even. Right now, we're not even repeating ourselves once for just checking and getting the value. If I try to run this now, you'll notice we get downing street. That works. And if, for example, the street is not defined, right, it's going to say no address provided. Simple enough. And then if the whole address is not defined, of course, it's also going to say no address provided, as you can see here. And you can even check if the person is null. You can even add an optional chaining here if you really want to. And the neat thing about optional chaining is that it also works with arrays and functions. So arrays, for example, if I have here this instead of home be houses, and be it an array of just one element for now, but syntactically it's going to be the same. Well, we want to get the first house, for example. So we're going to have to say here houses, and we add here of 0. Now this might seem very weird, right? We do question mark dot and then the dot 0. That's how the optional chaining operator is defined so far. I don't think they're gonna change it due to the fact that it's easier to parse for them this way. But basically how this reads is give me the first element of person.houses if person.houses is not null or undefined. If person.houses is null or undefined, then do give me undefined. So this syntax is only checking if houses itself is null or undefined. If it's undefined, we're going to actually not get any errors, right? So if I comment this out and try to run this, you'll notice I'm going to get no address provided. So this worked. It gave us null because what? Because person.houses was undefined. Thus, this whole statement returned undefined, and that's why we got this statement as being true, and then we got the message on the screen. But sure, houses might be undefined, but what if the actual element inside the array is null, for example? So what if this guy, this houses array, has two elements? The first one is null, and the second one is our object, for example. Well, if I try to run this now, you'll notice that I got an error. Cannot read property address of null. Why? Because person.houses is defined, it's an array, but person.houses of 0 is null, right? And then we wanted to do null.address. Notice no optional chaining here. So this is an issue. So you might want to add another optional chaining here so that you also check if the element itself is null or undefined. This also works. So this is the difference between adding the optional chaining before the indexing and after the indexing. So if I try to run this now, you'll notice I'm going to get the proper result where it says just no address provided, because not that person.houses was null or undefined, but the first element of person.houses was null or undefined. Thus the whole statement returned undefined. And same thing with functions. If, for example, instead of houses we have get home, and this guy is a function that will return our home object. So just one object, no arrays here. Just gonna have to add another bracket here. I hope it's not really well formatted. Let me just format it somewhat decent. Something like that, and a semicolon here. So right, it just returns this object. Well, we're gonna have to call it somewhere, so I'm gonna call it here instead of this whole thing. So if I say get home like this, well, this is fine, it's gonna work right now because everything is defined and everything is nice and amazing. We get Downing Street. But the problem arises is if not that we are returning null here. So if I just comment this out, this is fine. This is going to be fine. Why? Because as you can see, we're going to get a no address provided message. So since this guy is actually returning undefined, right? Due to us having here an optional chaining operator, we're going to return simply an undefined here. So the street is just going to be undefined. But what if the actual function that we're trying to call is undefined? Well, if I actually do this instead, comment out the function itself, so we don't know if the function exists or not. If I try to run this, you'll notice that we get an error. It says person.getHome is not a function. How do we check if getHome is defined using the optional chaining operator? We simply have to prefix the parentheses for the call with the chaining operator, just like so. It does look weird in my opinion, but this is how it is. So what this says is first check if this guy exists, if this guy is defined, and then call the function. So if I try to run this now, you'll notice that I get no address provided and no errors. But what if get home is actually not a function? If it's, let's say, an object, let's say the home object itself is get home for some strange reason. Well, let's change that in our code. So if I change this to be the actual result, like so, does it check, does the optional chaining operator check if this is a function because we've called it and return undefined, or does it give us an error? This is the question, right? So here we're checking if get home is null or undefined, which it isn't. It's an object. It's a defined object. And then we're calling it. We're calling the object. What will the optional operator or optional chaining operator do in this situation? If I try to run this, you'll notice that I'll get an error here that says person get home.call is not a function. So basically we tried to call something that wasn't a function. So as you can see, the optional chaining operator doesn't really check if it's a function, if it's an array, if it's an object. It just kind of checks if it's null or undefined, and that's it. It doesn't provide any more checks. So that's something that you're going to have to do on your own. But this is fine because most of the time, get home is going to be a function, houses is going to be an array, and home is going to be an object. Now this feature is in the latest stages of implementation, so it's going to be very soon added to the standard. And you're going to see it added in Node, added in Chrome, in V8, in Firefox, in everything, in a very short amount of time, I think. Although this feature is not yet available on any of the browsers or Node as well. It's only available on Babel with a certain plugin installed, and that's what I'm using here. I'm going to leave a link down below where you can check whether or not the feature has already been implemented in any of the browsers or Node. So I hope you got something out of it. Do leave in the comments what do you think are the best use cases for this in your project, for example, that you're working on. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Take care. Bye.